Hey folks, and welcome to the beta studies look at our third covenant, the Venthyr, from the perspective of a Resto Druids DPS via Catweaving or Owlweaving. We have a lot to get through, so let's get started. As with the Necrolords and the Night Fae, we are splitting this into 4 parts. The signature or neutral ability, the class ability, the Soulbinds, before finally combining all of them together along with our legendary and Conduit research to get some rough numbers to see how they compare with the rest. Speaking of comparing, before testing there was a beta build that buffed Moonfire and Sunfire. From my research it looks like about a 30% damage buff, that is with Fury of the Skies Conduit active, which is about 59 extra points per tick and about 50 DPS each. This means numbers will be higher than before. Removing or adding 100% DPS isn't a perfect solution, but these figures are just meant to be rough, so if anything is too far in one direction we'll be able to spot it. Now, onto the signature. Draw of Shadows is an ability with much hype due to stripping potential. It's a teleport surpassing Blink, but its 1.5 second cast limits some of its combat prowess. But how well does it actually do its stripping? Well, it has a 35 yard range, and that is actually pretty short. The simple mob here in Revendreth here needs to be stripped using a diagonal and getting close enough without actually aggroing. In a dungeon setting, most of the time there will be walls around or groups of just more than one mob, so I'm not quite sure this is going to live up to the hype. In my mind it seems weaker than the others in fact, but as we've said before, the signature is a bonus, it won't define your choice. Ravenous Frenzy is the class ability. It's a 20-second buff with a 3-minute cooldown. Every ability you cast increases your damage, healing, haste, and if using the Conduit, crit by 2% per stat gained. Downside, if you go 1.5 seconds without using any ability, you'll take damage, get stunned, and lose all your stacks. A few notes before we look at the figures here. Moving does not count as being active, however casting does, so you do not have to worry about Starfire's long casting ruining this. Feral Affinity can have some issues earlier on though, as its energy regeneration can stall out, forcing you to have to cast Sunfire in order to not get stunned. I imagine this will get easier though as more haste comes later on in the expansion. You'll also always need to be aware of fight mechanics that may cause you to succumb to the frenzy. On screen are the figures, and for the downsides of this ability, they are not good on paper. Like always, this is without its Conduit, which I believe is the strongest of the conduits relating to these abilities. Its window offers roughly the same boost as the others, but its long cooldown puts it at the bottom so far. Balance performs better this time, namely thanks to how it doesn't need to adapt its rotation to not get stunned, or spend time shifting or relying on dots. Feral may get higher stacks, but it has to be inefficient to get them. So why is it bad here? Lacking its Conduit is one thing, but the other is how healer DPS works. Healers obviously deal less damage than the main DPS, and this comes from the power of individual spells and less abilities in general. Less damage on abilities affects all signature powers, but as Frenzy relies on high ability usage, the lack of options hurt healers even more here. An easy comparison is our Affinity to their base specs. Feral Affinity has less energy regeneration than Feral, so it can't keep up, and Balance Affinity lacks the instant cast talents and Star Surge that Balance itself has. In the end, this ability requires a lot of fast actions that are not suited to us. Yet. Can the Soulbinds help out though? Let's check them out because there are some really strong showings. First up is Nagia the Mistblade, and a choice between Disorientate or Speed Boost to Draw of Shadows, though the real question is potency versus defensive. So potency is going to be what we do, and lock in the Endless Thirst, that's the Venthyr Covenant Conduit. One of the Wilds and more rubies in Revendreth is next, whatever those are, before a choice. The second Finesse with a 15% buff to food, flasks and weapon buffs, a Potency with CC reduction, and my choice, a defensive with Dauntless Duelist, perhaps the strongest trait across any Soulbind. It's a 4 damage buff to the first target you hit in any combat, as well as taking 2% less damage from them. For single targets, like most boss fights, this is very powerful. Last up is Fury of the Skies, before a final stacking buff that eventually gives you a crit buff. Now, overall, for single target especially, this is perhaps the strongest Soulbind for us in the entire game. Next up is Theatar the Mad Duke, and it starts with a choice for Door of Shadows, either a root freeing or another charge but longer CC. Although you can break your own roots anyway, the real choice here is potency versus finesse, and it comes down to a later choice really. Here I'm going with finesse for Born of the Wilds, but if you take a different route later on, take the potency here instead. The potency is next for either Thirst or Fury before we have the choice. Here is a potion duration buff with a defensive, a mastery buff with finesse, or giving a shield to allies that help you with a potency. I think stripping the potion buff is a good idea, and while I would go for the shield with a potency, I can also see the reason for going mastery with finesse. I think Theatar himself just lends himself to a group setting a bit better. Next up is a defensive before either something for your Ember Court mini event, or free goodies before Tea Time, which during Frenzy gives you 10% versatility and 4 other players 4% versatility. Pretty good group buff, but Frenzy's uptime is only 11%, so Dreamweaver's uptime is going to be much better. General Draven is last up, starting with either durability or some world movement speed, both to a defensive. The choice is up next, Intellect with a finesse, a crit buff when dispelling with a defensive, or stamina and healing while standing still with a potency. To me, the Intellect and Born of the Wild looked best. Next up is our first potency for Thirst, before a shield on Door of Shadows or movement speed buff, but really it's potency versus defensive, and we need that potency for Fury. Finally, it ends with Servicing Stone, a defensive buff below 40% health with AoE damage and healing when you die. I think Nadja is the strongest most of the time. However, if you find yourself struggling to contribute much DPS, Theatar will help out your allies. So the base ability was a bit of a letdown. However, the Soulbinds and Conduits have been strong. So taking Nadja, Circle of Life and Death, that's our best legendary, let's look at the total figures. As with the other Covenants, we are going to do 4 different tests for single target, each over 5 minutes. 2 will be Feral Affinity and 2 will be Balance Affinity. One of each using 10 global cooldowns a minute to simulate more healing intensive parts, and 30 global cooldowns a minute where we can spend more time DPSing. Also remember that due to the Moonfire and Sunfire buff, these DPS figures will be around 100 higher than they were before this build. Right, let's get started with Feral. So at 10 global cooldown uses a minute, we see the worst performing damage so far. Be aware that 10 global cooldowns means only damaging global cooldowns, so healing spells do keep buffing up Frenzy. However, Frenzy is a buff to stats on a cooldown, and when you can't make use of that time window, it's no surprise that you're going to struggle. When we go to 30 global cooldowns a minute, suddenly we see a massive increase. Frenzy on its own wasn't the best damage, but finally, with the crit added to the stacks, and Nadja's amazing 4% damage buff, the floodgates have really opened. Venthyr Feral, even with the bonus of 100 DPS from the latest build, surpasses both Necrolords and the Night Fae damage by well over the 100 DPS. Before I go over why I think these numbers are very high, let's look at Balance Affinity. As with every other case at low global cooldown usage, Balance Affinity comes out ahead. Heart of the Wild only buffs Moonfire and Sunfire as Balance Affinity, but the figures are still lower than both of the other Covenants and the reasons are going to be the same. Frenzy requires constant input to make use of, and for DPS, low global cooldown uses is not it. Despite benefiting more from the base Frenzy than Feral Affinity, at 30 global cooldowns, Balance Affinity is back to its lowest spot. Part of this is me trying out another Eclipse variation, which clearly shows you that if you want to go Balance Affinity with Venthyr, during this window you need Solar Eclipse up. Lunar Eclipse does not cut it. However, even when using Solar Eclipse, balance just loses out in every other window. It's becoming pretty obvious that once you move past being able to use Moonfire, Sunfire and occasionally Star Surge, Feral Affinity takes the lead. Still, both affinities are quite far ahead of their counterparts in the Necrolords and the Night Fae, so why is that? Firstly, I have a feeling that the Endless Thirst Conduit is broken. At the moment, I'd use Frenzy, everything would crit. It's meant to increase your crit chance by 2% per stack, but it felt more like 100% per stack. The default gear left me with 9% crit buff, but with this Conduit I was critting everything right away. Honestly, I think this is the biggest cause of the high damage. Next up, Nadia is just strong. 4% on a single target surpasses any other Soulbind for us, and the fact that she also offers crit buffs, a finesse and 2 potency, as well as 2% damage reduction, she is very powerful. Then of course there is the downsides with Frenzy. It requires constant input to work. To get those figures you need 20 seconds of pure damage dealing. Swarm and Convoke have far fewer restrictions and are far less punishing as well when you make a mistake. Frenzy can backfire horribly, so you could argue it deserves to be stronger. The Venthyr Covenant may be the strongest on paper, but for many players they'll probably find more success with the Necrolords of the Night Fae. Not to mention that during healing intensive fights, the Venthyr's damage properties drop off considerably. On the whole though, all three seem fairly balanced and each one is bound to rule in a different scenario. We have one more Covenant before I look at comparing all four. That is the Kyrian, one that I've not been a fan of its ability. Speaking of, there may be some delay with getting this one out, as I need a friend to help me test it, but for now, thanks for watching.